Lernen Blatt Gemara. We are up to Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph, the Mishnah. As I mentioned to you yesterday already that the Gemara, the last third of the first Bava Metzia is quite technical, and basically we're discussing here if you find a document and there's a lender and a borrower or a husband and a wife, who do you give it back to? The very fact that it fell down brings up a reis, it brings up some kind of a weakness that maybe there's something wrong with the shtar. And the question is, what is wrong with that shtar? So we are up to the Mishnah of Yud Ches Amud Aleph. And before we talked about loan contracts, now we're talking about other documents. And we have an interesting argument here in the Gemara, as we'll see. Says the Mishnah, we found a divorce of a wife. And Shechruri Avodim, we found a bill of divorce for an Eved, or a daitiki, a person who is dying gives the last instructions where to distribute his wealth. That's called a daitiki, or dotehekoi, this is how it should be. A matana, a contract where you gifted someone something, and shaving, a receipt. And the question is, where did it come from? You don't return it to anybody. Why not? I can say, perhaps they were written, and then it was decided not to give it, not to use it. And why would you even think so? Because it fell on the floor. You found it on the ground, which means somebody wasn't taking care of it properly, didn't give it enough value. And why did you give enough value? Because maybe it wasn't really used. So it's only a possibility, and therefore we don't know what to do, leave things the way they are. Says the Gemara, Taima, it seems to me the only reason is the Nimlech, because possibly the person changed his mind. Shaloi Litna, that maybe he decided not to use this document. What happens if Amar Tanu? What happens if he says, give it back? Let's say you found a divorce, and the husband says, yes, give it to the wife. Now, you give it back, even if you found it 6 months later. And what's the problem? Why shouldn't you give it back? Because how do you know? Because in a get, all it says is the name of the person, and maybe the husband and the wife. How do we know for certain that this get is between this man and this woman? Might be another person who share the same names, especially if it's a long time later. So it seems to the mission, nevertheless, if you say give it, nice to give it, I feel as mamaruma, even a long time later. So to me, I have a question. We learned elsewhere, how maybe get if somebody brings a divorce of a man and you lost it. So there it says as follows. But so you found it straight away, enough time for a caravan, less time than it takes a caravan to leave and come back. Then kosher, we'll assume it's the same document you lost, that's what you found. But if it's longer than that, it's possible that there was a caravan, a group of people came in from elsewhere, and one of them dropped it, who happened to have the same name as you and his wife the same name as your wife. Then possible it is possible. So our mission seems to say that in all instances, if you find it even 6 months later, we'll give it back to you. There it seems to say if it's a long time later, we don't give it back. So we're going to have an argument how to make a distinction between the two. When do we give it back and when don't give it back? When are we worried? When aren't we worried? So there's two variables there. One is the locals versus foreigners, tourists, or wherever people come in. That's number one. And number two is, do we knowing that there are two people in the same vicinity with the same names versus perhaps there's someone else with the same name. One is called a muhzik and one is not a muhzik. So we're going to have an argument between the Amoraim, which of these variables have to come into play before we say we're worried. Amar Abba says, like Kasha. Where you have a number of people coming in from outside, then we are worried. And here's a place where people don't come from outside. People don't come from outside, we will return it. If people come from far away, we are worried, it may be. And then he goes further. Even people coming far away, you need two variables before we say we don't give it back. Number one is we know there are a number of foreigners that come in. And we also know from the city where they're coming from, there's somebody else with the same names. Or provided they know for a fact that there are two people with the same name. If you're not going to say that, no, the Gemara is the one who concludes that even if you know people coming from abroad, that you also have to know for sure that there are two people with the same name. If you don't think that Rabbah holds you need both of these chshoshes, then we have a problem, a contradiction between Rabbah and Rabbah. In other words, you need two problems. Number one is that in this city, there's two people with the same name. But that on its own is not yet enough to say to disqualify this get, and I give it back to him. And plus, there are people coming from overseas, so now you have two shashes, and therefore we don't give it back. But if only have one shash, only people from overseas, or in this, or only in this town, you have two people with the same name, but nobody's coming from far away, and you dropped it. All likelihood is probably yours, and I'll prove it to you. If you don't think that Rabbi holding any bowl, Tasha the Rabbi was contradiction. Rabbi who get it? There was once a get. The Shtaka Beidina the Rabbi Huna. There was once a get that was found inside the bezin of Huna. Now we're going to treat the inside of the bezin of Rabbi Huna, the court of Rabbi Huna, as if foreigners are coming here, because if people from far and wide would come to settle their disputes in Rabbi Huna's bezin. And therefore, that's considered a place shayoris mitzuyisham. You have plenty of people, not locals, that come there as well. And this is what it says in the get. In the city of Shvedi, most of the city of Shvedi, Al Rochis Nara, that's sitting there on the river of Rochis. That's what's written in the get. So there's also a geographical place plus the names. Rav Huna said, I am worried. Maybe there's another city with that same name, so we cannot return it. No, according to Rav Huna, just the fact that you have people coming from far away is enough of a chash that maybe one of the people from far away brought the get with them, and they have that same name somewhere else, and therefore we can't give it back. Even though somebody stood there and said, "It's my get, I dropped it, and definitely it's mine." We don't give it back. So according to Rav Huna, one chash is sufficient. Rav Chizah said to Rabbi, who was students of Rav Huna, "Puk aimba, why don't you go and analyze this further? Because definitely at night, boy, Rav Huna is going to ask you this very question. What do you think?" So I'm giving you a heads up. Prepare yourself. Nothing went out. Doki searched. Doki he analyzed. Ashkan he found the following. Now it says in the Mishnah, which we just had, that call my we had said in the Mishnah that call my sebezin, that any my sebezin. It says there that all my sebezin hareze yachs. Any debt that you have, because bezin rule that's how it is, then you have to return it to the. No, we spoke yesterday about a ksuva. Then you have to give it back to the person there who is the claimant. Now, Beidina, the Rav Huna, not the bezin of Huna, the chimokim shashi aretz mitzuyazam. The bezin of Huna, no. So Rabba rules clearly. You give it back. You give it back to the person. Now, the bezin of Huna is a place where there's one chash. It's a place where there are plenty of people coming in, and yet the kopasha Rabba the yachzin. Rabbi says he gave it back. Rabbi just said a minute ago that the only time you don't give it back is if in a place where people don't come from far away, just the locals. But in a place that people coming from other places, from outside, we don't give it back. We're worried that maybe it came from there. So how can Rabbi here say you do give it back? Must be that when Rabbi said in our Gemara that you don't give it back if people come from far away, he's talking about when you have two shashes, people from far away, plus locally there's another person with the same name as you and his wife is like your wife. Alma, what we see, you have to say that Rabbi holds only when you have two shashes, we don't return it. Says the Gemara, Obad Rabba once paskined. Actually, it wasn't just theory. He actually paskined exactly the way he ruled. They kissed the Pupadisa at the house of garments in Pupadisa, Kishmaiti, like his ruling. What actually happened there? And we say that what you need two shashes before he rules that you don't give it back. And the two versions as to, there was only one chash. Which was the one chash? Ikidami, there was one version that they say, it was a place where they sell the garments. It was like a market. And therefore, lots of people come to buy. So there was one chash there, lots of people come. And yet, nevertheless, he gave it back for Hushla because we did not know there were two people with the same name in the city. So there was only one chash. People who came from far away. Is Afagav the Shishma Shayat, even though people came, he allowed it. He said, give it back. Because one chash is not enough. Not like Rabbi Huna. Others say, Heicha the Torikis, it was a place where they washed, where they laundered the garments. That's not a public place. That's very few people go there. I forgot the who's good. But even though in the city there were two people with exactly the same name, he said, give it back because you only had one chash. Because you don't have caravans from far away coming. Okay, so we have an argument between Rabbi and Huna. According to Rabbi, the only time you don't give it back is without two chashes. Lots of people come from distant places, and plus we've established that locally there's someone else with the same name. One chash is not enough to prevent it from giving back, and even a long time later. And according to Rabbi Huna, one chash is enough to say, wait, don't give it back. Rab Zayda, Romi Masnisi Nabraisa. Rab Zeda asked a question from a Mishnah on the Braisa, Umashani answered. Tanan, it says in the Mishnah, Hamiv, get somebody brings a get. But hey, Menu, he lost it. He found it straight away. Kashim Lav Puzzle, which you just had. But Aminu, so Rabba asked a question from this Mishnah on our Mishnah. Here in the Mishnah it says over here that if a long time later you don't give it back, and our Mishnah seems to say there's no difference. Long time later, not long time later, you always do give it back. That was Rabba's way of asking a question, and then he came up with the answer about people foreigners or not. Rab Zeda asks on our Mishnah, but from another Bryce. Rab Zeda asks on this Mishnah that Rabba brought, plus he asks from a Bryce on the Mishnah, not from our Mishnah. And he was going to query that. If you found it straight away, you can give it back, but a long time later, we're worried it came from somebody else. But Aminu has a question that says, in the Braisa, if you found the get of a woman out in the street, in the marketplace, the husband's made, yes, it belongs to her, give it back to her. Ain't about you don't give it back. Telling me, as it says clearly, the husband agrees that it belongs to her. She give it back to the woman, and there's no time limit. I feel it, Mamaruba. Now, this Mishnah we just quoted said a long time later, give it back because maybe the possibility came from somebody else. And yet this Bryce says clearly, no matter how long it takes, you give it back. If the husband admits that this is, or concedes that this is his get, you give it back. He answered the same like Rabba. If there are other foreigners coming in, then we're worried. If no foreigners come in, we're not worried. Even a long time later. Now, within within the Rab Zeda himself, it's not clear if he agrees with Rabba. In other words, you need two chashas or one. So one version is the line neder. That when does Rab Zeda say that if the foreigner is coming in, you don't give it back? It has to be one, provided that also we know for a fact that in this area that two people with the same name, that's when you don't give it back. Behind the Rabba, it's exactly like Rabba, two shashas. And there's another version, even if it not been established, one chash is enough. Neder upliga the Rabbi argued the Rabbi agrees with Rabbi that even one chash is enough reason we don't give the gut back. Now, we're digressing. Rabbi didn't ask from the Bryce on the Mishnah, but rather he asked from that Mishnah on our Mishnah here. Could we inferred from our Mishnah? But if he would have said give it back, we'd give it back no matter how much later, how come, and he gives us that answer. Because you always ask better ask questions from a Mishnah on the Mishnah than from a Bryce on the Mishnah. Why would Rab Zeda prefer to ask a question from a Bryce on that Mishnah rather than from our Mishnah on that Mishnah? Amalek will tell you, because our Mishnah doesn't clearly say, it's merely an inference. Our Mishnah says that you don't give it back. You don't give it back. So then we're medayik. But if he would have said tnu, and the reason is because we're saying maybe he changed his mind. So then we're medayik. So we infer. But what happened? We're extrapolating. What happens if he would have said, "Do give it back"? We give it back. And let me ask a question. So Rab Zeda says it's not clearly in our Mishnah. That's what we were medayik, right? We extrapolate our Mishnah, but dilma ha'amatnu naisin. But not necessarily so. In our Mishnah, you could interpret the Mishnah that even if he clearly said, "Give it back to my wife." So you say it's a Rav Mamru, but Dilma ha'amatnu naisin. Maybe Taka, you give it back if you said Tanu, but maybe only if it's right away. The Mishnah didn't bother going into details because it's only an inference. Well, I'll get a kaim louter. Maybe our Mishnah agrees with that with that other Mishnah that the only time you return it is if he says give it back, if it happens straight away, not if it took a long time. And even though our Mishnah make a distinction, our Mishnah it's only an inference, so you don't make distinctions in an inference. Okay, so therefore, Rab Zeda thought the Bryce is clearly not like the Mishnah, and he gave the same thing. Now, we said two versions, whether Rab Zeda agrees with Rabba, and you need two shashes, or whether Rab Zeda disagrees, and you only need one shash. Says the Gemara, the man, the Aman, that view that says, according to Rab Zeda, the Malkim, Shishai, Yad, that Rab Zeda agrees with the Rab Huna, that if we only even have one shash, comes from foreigners, even though we don't have a second shash that we know for a fact that two people with the same name. The Rabba, and he argues with Rabba, but my committee, what exactly is the argument? What's the crux of their argument? So Rabba holds the Tani, Kol Maise Bezin Hareze Yachse, when it says that every activity from a Bezin, you always give it back to that person, because we know it's an authentic star and so on. The Shtakach, the Bezin Askin, what he meant was, when it says in the Mishnah, Kol Maase Bezin Hareze Yachse means if you found it in the Bezin. And now we know a bezin is treated like a bunch of foreigners come there, because they do. People come from far away to settle their disputes. And yet it says you give it back. So when don't we give it back? Must be you need a second shash. That you know for a fact that two people with the same names. So therefore, when don't we give it back? Well, who if we know for a fact that somebody else with the same name, so he learns kol ma'aseh bezin means any ma'aseh bezin, but more than that, it had to be found in the bezin, in the domain of the bezin itself, which is a region where many people, there's an influx of people from everywhere, far and wide. But Abzeda says, Kol Maise Bezin doesn't mean you have to find it in the Bezin itself. Abzeda says, Miktoni Kol Maise Bezin Shanim to Bezin, you found it in the Bezin. Kol Maise Bezin, any obligation that emanates from a Bezin, doesn't matter where you found it. You found it outside. You found it outside, and therefore it makes no difference. You found it outside, and therefore there's no Shayadas Matsuyasham. But if there's one if there is one chash that sheyad is mitzuyisham, right away we're going to say we cannot give back the get because maybe it came from some foreigner. Rabbi Yimi says when it says yachzim, when it says kol ma'aseh bezin, yachzim is talking about going to ka'amri edim. The witness come along and say me'olam lechasamnu el al get echad shel Yosef ben Shimon. The only time he says if you find a get and you give it back is if the witnesses who are signed it says we never signed. The second get, the only get we signed was with one man. His name is Yosef ben Shimon, and his wife, whatever her name is, and that's it. Because the Edim who signed it said this is the only get they signed. That's why we return it. So we need more conclusive evidence that you can give it back. Says if the Edim say they only signed one get, of course it's kosher. No, because we can say, just like we're worried that maybe there's a man and a woman who share the same names as this man and woman here, maybe the two witnesses on the sign and they also share the same names. Maybe we should take it further and say that even the witnesses might be the same. That far we don't go. That far to say that not only the husband and wife have the same names, but all the witnesses have the same names, that's really going too far. And we're not worried. Ravashi says, you know what it's talking about, why we give it back? You're going to Ka'amar. The husband says, or Nekev Yesh Boy Bitsad, or if no, I believe the husband, he said there's a little puncture next to a certain letter. And because he said there's a little puncture next to certain, that we know there's a thing called a simon. We're going to learn If you lose something, somebody else finds it. If that person has a simon, you return it. That's some kind of a indication it's theirs. And there's different degrees of simonim. There's a simon called simon muvik. We'll learn all about this later. Is a simon muvik mean which is a conclusive, and then there's a simon she'ena muvik. That it's not necessarily prove that it's yours because other people might do it as well, but obviously it's far less. There's a good chance that it is yours. So it's talking about a case, if a person would have said there's a puncture in the get, that's not a simon moving, that's a stam simon, because it could be over time that punctures. But if you say there's a hole next to the letter Yud, for example, and turns out to be there is one, that's called a simon moving. That's very compelling and that's conclusive. So Rashi says, you know why we give it back? You're going to Ka'amar. It says, he said, Nekev yesh boy b'tzad ois plonis. It's a whole puncture next to a certain letter, and therefore we give it back. Now, the dafke b'tzad ois plonis. Dafke, if he says right next to a particular letter. I will nekeb alma, but stamahol loy. But stamahol is not strong enough. There is a question which we're going to have here, and we'll discuss later, and that is the whole concept of simonim. We'll have a middle name and see it. The whole concept of simonim is that the Torah saying, we know witnesses work. Is simonim being effective? Is that my Torah? Is that only midrabanan? If it's midrabanan, the rabbanan say, look, we have to learn how to live with each other as a society. So we're going to make a special rule that if somebody can prove that the object is there just through a simon, you don't always have the edim that was yours, is good enough. And the Rabbanan have that power because hefke bez and hefke. But if simonim is only the Rabbanan, it's not going to work when it comes to a get. Hefke bez and hefke doesn't help by a get. So therefore, a simon, if it's not really compelling, we're not going to return the get. But if you hold simonim the raisa, if you hold that a simon is from the Torah, that the Torah recognizes a simon as strong enough proof, just like edim, then maybe even a stam simon will be good enough to return it. He says here, was not 100% certain what's the basis for returning a lost object based on simonim. Is simonim deraisa, then even if it's a din of the Torah, whatever it is, like a get, we would return it to the woman because the simon is very compelling. Or maybe it's only rabbanon. So therefore, it's only rabbanon. We don't give it back. So by a get, we won't give it back to her just because you have a simon. But by an aveda, we will because hefke bez and hefke. Is Rabba bar Chana, Ichas like Git Rabba Bar Chana once lost his get. Bei Medrasha in the base of Medrash, Amar, he said, Isamana Isli Begaboy. If you're looking for a simon, I have a very good simon there, and I'll give it to you. And Tvias Eina, and if it's a question of recognizing, Tvias Ein is recognizing it, Isli Begabo Ahadrun Nele. Then I also have it. And Ahadrun Nele, they gave it back to him. And Omri said, I'm not sure, is it because I gave them a simon? That's why he gave it back to me? Because simon, in other words, simon is mahatayra, and therefore, even though it's a get, the Torah recognizes that's good evidence, or because of simon deraisa, or imishum tvias ein adru, or maybe it's only tvias ein, and only gave because tvias ein. But a simon is only with the rabbanon, they wouldn't have given the get. But the fact that I recognize it, that's stronger than a simon. The dafke tzur rabbanon, only if it's a tamil chacham. I will in the a person like we not give it back to tvias ein. Tvias ein is machlek. Rashi tells you why not amaritz. Rashi says that only a tamil chacham has the ability to be able to what do you call it? To have tvias ein, or because we say a tamil chacham will say the truth. If he says it's tvias, I recognize he's telling the truth. Amaritz, we're not sure he's telling the truth. Maybe he is lying, even though they also have tvias ein. Maybe sure he's lying. Others learn that only a tamil chacham has tvias ein. And Mishra Magid learns. And what does tvias ein mean? He says that tvias ein means that your eye, every single tzaddik has an avodah, and the avodah is like every person to elevate in the tzutzes, the sparks of Hashem. That's all over the world. But a tzaddik knows which sparks they have to elevate. So the tvias ein means that the eye can sink into this keli and see that this keli has netzutzes that have a connection to me. Otherwise, why would I have a relationship with this piece with this material thing? So a tzaddik is the only one who has tvias ein, that the Torah recognizes, that his eye is able to see the inside of the keli and recognize that this is his keli or her keli, and this is where the avodah is. But Amara does not have a capacity. Saying more further, so we don't resolve this question of whether Simonim is Mahatayra or Midrabanan, because he didn't ask them, I guess, and they didn't tell him. Kufa, let's analyze this. You found a get of a woman in the street. The husband says, yes, it's my wife. Yachzeli should give it back to her. Ain't a Balmaida, the husband does not acknowledge his wife, so Yachzeli don't give it back. Now the question is, but if he says it's hers, Yachzeli should give it back to the woman, right? You give it back to her. And we said in the place we're not chayshish because there's nobody from overseas, or even there is people from overseas, we haven't established the fact that there's two people with the same names, pending Rabba or Rabuna. That's a very simple question. Why there is a concern? What happens if the husband wrote the get? The date is a certain time. He wrote the get at that time, but he didn't give it to her for whatever reason. Embarrassed her, he didn't give it to her 6 months later. In the meantime, he continued eating her nichse meloy. When a woman gets married, she brings in properties. This nichse tzembarza, nichse meloy. Nichse meloy is a pluck nechasim, which is he gives over to the husband. The husband maintains it and puts in all the effort, and he reaps the dividends. And when she leaves, she takes the property back. So it's like a plucked property. So this nichse meloy, he's entitled to it because he works on it and he provides for it and everything else. But once he decided not to divorce her, he and he'll continue. He'll continue eating nichse meloy or selling her properties, let's say selling the produce and everything else, making money. Then when she receives her get, the date of the get is 6 months earlier, she will go to all the people who bought the fruits from her husband and say, hey, you had no right to buy the fruits from my husband because I have a divorce from Nissen and he sold to you in Sivan, even though she didn't receive the get till Tishrei. No one knows that. So she said, look, I have a thing here from Nissen and my husband didn't come to you until sold it to you in Sivan, give me back my money. Why aren't we worried that there will be an injustice carried out here? Why did we just return the get? Says about why are you worried? Maybe the get was written in this. They didn't give it to her until Tishrei. And you say, okay, the husband says give it to her, and what's going to happen? Basil and Baal Zovin paid him in Tishrei. Meanwhile, the husband sold fruits and produce to make money. She will present her get. The cost of is written, dated. But also, she will go to every one of these purchasers and collect. You paid my husband? Go, it was my husband. He was divorced. Says Gemara. But this makes sense according to the opinion. The moment the husband decided he wants to divorce her, they're no longer amicable to each other. There's no point then he forfeits all of his rights to eat, to pluck the fruits. So in other words, he had no right to sell the fruit in the first place. So that's a separate story. But she has every right to get the money back because the husband was selling her fruits from the day that he decided to write the get. That day he no longer had a right. He forfeited all of his rights to the field. So therefore she has the right to collect the money back. Either the kuchas weren't aware and they're going to lose out, So that's between them and the husband in Torah. But she has a right. So what are we worried about? You can write the early date, but she has a right to collect. Shuvin about Pedis, then he had no right to eat to the fruit shop. It makes sense. Then it's not worried. But according to Mandam Yesh about Pedis, according to one who said that what until he actually physically gave her the get, the husband had the right. So why are you worried? The wife then later will double dip and she'll go to every one of those purchasers and collect the money again. Ma'i Kulmeimer. The Gemara says very simple. The Gemara says in this case here, when she comes with a get, when she will come to collect with this get, Amrinalo, they will tell her, I see Raya, they will tell her, bring a proof. Amos Matigilioda, when exactly did you receive this get from your husband? Then if so, you tell me we're never worried about an early date because they're always going to say bring proof when you actually received it. So how come we learned previously? You found a loan contract. If you found a loan contract and there was a chrayz nechasim, don't give it back. Why don't you give it back? So we learned the first interpretation we had in the Gemara was the borrower agrees, give it back, and still we're worried that maybe the date. On the thing predates the time of the actual loan, and therefore the guy will collect from the kuchas inappropriately. Now, what's the problem? Every lekoch will tell him, okay, you lost the get, you lost the shtar, they gave it back to you. Prove that you actually this transaction happened the date that's written on the get, just like by on this loan contract, just like by a get, we're not worried that she will take back because they'll say to her, you lost it, you got it back, everyone knows about it, so they've approved to us when you actually received the get. So the same thing will be a loan contract. They'll say you lost it, the Bezdin gave it back to you, prove to us that the loan actually took place on that date. Why are we worried by a loan and we're not worried about a get? We're worried that maybe predates it because sees properties from Kuchas incorrectly. Why don't you give it back? If the lender will come to the Kuchas to try to seize a field, namely, they'll tell him, I see that, bring the proof when you receive the shtar. Gemara says there's a big difference between a get when you lost and give it back, how you interpret the Bezdin's actions, versus a loan contract that was lost and you give it back, how you interpret the Bezdin's actions. And therefore, we're going to say, by a get, they're going to ask her prove it, and by a loan, they're going to accept that the date is correct, and that is as follows. The buyer comes, the buyer comes, and he demands from, tell me when you're divorced. Omar, he says, you know why the Rabbanan gave it back to get, even though l'chayda it's questionable the date they gave the get. You know why? We don't want aguna. We don't want a woman to be chained. We don't want to be locked up. So therefore, the Rabbanan were very lax, very easy. And even though halachically it's dubious, it's questionable, the dates and everything else, we want her to be free. But taser, and she shouldn't have to be an aguna. So now that you're coming, now you want to use this get not just to be free, but you want to use it collect property. Prove it to us that you have a right to these properties and the get wasn't given to you 6 months after this date. Now you're coming to seize property. This is not the laguna. Go out there and bring me a proof, bring witnesses, whatever, when you actually receive the get. But by a star life. The lekech will not ask the lender prove to me that the transaction took place on the same date as the shtar. And why not? I'm thinking to myself, the Lakeh thinks, why did they give him back to the shtar? The guy lost the shtar. Why did they give him back the shtar? If he had witnesses, then just bring the witnesses that I still own the money. There's only one reason why you have a shtar. The reason why you have a shtar is so that it gives you the right to collect from the kuchas. So Bezdin gave it back to him. That means Bezdin is really saying that he has a right to go to the kuchas. So what am I going to query? When was it given? Bezdin already probably did all the correct queries. Why did they give it back to him? If it's to prove the loan, he has witnesses. He'll just bring the witnesses that I borrowed money. Obviously, the Rabbanan sat down, they analyzed the situation. They must be that they realized that that transaction took place before I bought this field. So therefore, he has a right to come and collect from me, and I won't even query it. And that's why we don't give it back by choy, but by get, we will give it back. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow.